go back in time. All right, guys still there?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, so you got like the 5 masts on the right, and then in between the 5th and the 6th, you can kind of see like a dark spot in the green. Everybody see that?
It's kind of hard to see.
Okay, so right in there, that's like one machine gun nest. So the guys would be sitting there, the Germans would be sitting there with an 88 millimeter machine gun, and it was called Hitler something. I can't remember the name, but it could shoot over 1,000 rounds a minute, and they would just be like peppering the beach with bullets. And there were several of these along there. So I mean, the soldiers were basically, you know, in really bad position. And so one of those was my uncle, and this is his grave on the left. And you see up in the right-hand corner those like rusted metal things. Those are some of the obstacles that the Germans put in the water, and then they, you know, rigged them with mines so that when you touched them, they would explode. So I learned that my uncle, does everybody see on his grave where it says T. Sergeant on the left-hand side under his name? That means he was a technical sergeant, so he was an engineer, and his job was to go in first, and if he could get to the beach, run up to the beach and secure it. But before that, he and his platoon had to disarm all of the bombs on those obstacles. So it was a really tough job. And so he got shot on the 6th. He went in at like, so the whole thing started at like 6:30 in the morning, and he went in at just a little before 7. And he was shot, and he lived until the 8th. So he kind of lingered for a couple days. And then they buried him in this temporary cemetery, which is down on the right, the bottom right. And then once the war was over, they moved his remains to the permanent cemetery, and that's his grave marker. So what's interesting I learned is that almost everybody in here is Christian, so they're covered with the cross. But there were a few people who were of Jewish faith, so there's a few Star of Davids on here. In the cemetery, but the Jewish soldiers were told by the Americans to not have their religion put on their dog tags, because if they were captured by the Germans, they would be immediately executed. So many of the German soldiers that fought for America didn't have their religious insignia on their dog tags, but some of them decided to anyway, and some of them just put painted a J in their uniform so people would know that they were Jewish. But most everybody has a cross. So then I went to this place called Pont du Hoc, which means hook point because it's geographically shaped like a point. And this is where the Germans had these huge guns that they used for shooting at boats and at airplanes as well. And they kind of like rotated. So they were like on these gears that allowed them to kind of swivel back and forth. And so the Germans knew they were going to be a target for the Allies, so they actually created real guns and fake guns. So they had decoys set up that kind of like, so the Allies thought that they were hitting the real guns, but they were actually hitting the fake guns. But the geography here was much different because it was unlike Omaha Beach, which was like that long 300-yard run. This was these very steep mountains or cliffs, and the Rangers actually had to like rappel themselves up, or I don't know what the opposite of rappel is, pull themselves up. So it was like Batman-esque, where like they would shoot the grappling hook up there and hope it would hook onto something, and then they'd have to pull themselves up. And the weather was bad, so the cotton rope was really wet, so they kept slipping. Meantime, the Germans are like firing machine guns down the cliff at them. So again, it'd be like hard to even imagine being in that situation. But the Rangers were such good soldiers because they're like the elite. They made it up. The first one was up in like 5 minutes, and then the whole platoon made it up in like 20, and they took over this place. So On the left, you can see that was the cliff that the soldiers had to get themselves up. And you can see the barbed wire in the foreground there. And then on the right is a bunker that used to have a gun in it that the Germans used. And then the circle thing is the remains of one of those huge cannons that would rotate around in this circle so that they could move the guns and shoot whichever direction they wanted to. But when the bombs exploded, when the Allied bombs exploded and blew these guns up, like it blew it to smithereens. So all that's left is kind of like the outline of where the gun used to be. And then this is like a shot from above. Does everybody see those craters, those huge craters?
Yeah.
Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So those are the huge craters that were created by the American bombs when the planes came over and bombed this area. So in Omaha Beach, because of the geography, the planes had to come in perpendicular to the beach. But because of the geography here, the planes came in parallel to the beach. So they literally just like carpet bombed this whole area. And these are those huge craters that are left from the bombs. And you can kind of see one of those big circles where the guns, German guns were at. And you can kind of see that path there leads down into one of those German bunkers that was underneath the gun. So again, it's like amazing to think, 70 years ago, people were where I was, and huge bombs were falling from the sky and blowing things up, and it's just very, very sobering to be there. And then I wanted to end with the paratroopers. So we've talked a lot about the amphibious assault, so the troops coming up on from water. But before that happened, Allied troops started to parachute in, and they parachuted inland, so they didn't land like on the coast. They landed several miles in, and they used glider planes that didn't have engines so that the Germans wouldn't hear them coming, which the glider would fly over, and then all the people would jump out, all the parachuters would jump out, and then the plane would try and land. Or the glider plane didn't have many troops in it, but would have like one glider plane could carry 2 pilots and a Jeep and a trailer, or 2 pilots and a huge gun. And so they would have to land somewhere, and the gliders would try and land in the fields of the farmers. And it was done at night, so they didn't have a very good view. Even though I didn't know this, but the entire D-Day mission was planned around when the full moon was, so that when these night operations were going on, the troops would be able to have moonlight to see what they were doing. But they tried to land in fields that had cows in them, because they knew that if there were cows in the field, that the Germans hadn't put landmines on the field. So they tried to land these gliders in these huge fields that had, cows. So it would land, and then it'd be like plowing through a whole herd of cattle. But that was better than landing on mines. So anyway, they landed, and sometimes it was successful, but a lot of times it wasn't. It was like 50-50. Half of the planes landed okay, and half the planes crashed and killed most everybody on board. And they also put what was called Rommel asparagus. So Rommel was the German who was in charge of all of the defense for Germany on the French coast. And they basically took like these huge telephone poles and shoved them in the ground, so they looked like asparagus stalks. And so when planes would try and glide in and land, they would run into these telephone poles and completely rip the plane apart. And they also created these amazing dike systems. So they controlled the flow of water, and when they knew that the mission was kind of imminent, the D-Day was going to happen, they opened the dikes and they flooded all the low-lying areas. So when either the plane landed or the troops landed, they would get trapped in the plane, or they would get trapped in their parachutes, and many of the paratroopers just drowned before they even had a chance to engage in any kind of fighting. They drowned in the water. So, I mean, the Germans, they knew what they were doing too. So this little village here, the Saint-Marais-Anglais, that was that one I showed you earlier. That was the first village that was liberated by the Allies. but lots and lots of troops died there. So on their church still, on the left is a soldier hanging from the church. So there was a soldier named John Steele who literally he landed on top of the church and was stuck hanging there. And the Germans captured him. And then he ended up escaping and fought in the Battle of the Bulge and stuff. But like, that's just an example. Like, they would land everywhere, because you didn't really know where you were going to land. So you might land on a church, you might land in somebody's backyard, you might land, right in the middle of a German, stronghold. So you never really knew what was going on. Do you see the stained glass window up on the right?
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you see there?
Archangel?
The
top right.
That one.
Water
Oh,
and
I can't really tell.
You see the paratroopers?
Are they paratroopers?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, they're paratroopers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this church, unlike the one here in Bayeux, was mainly destroyed during the war. So all the stained glass windows were blown out, so they had to replace them. So they replaced them, and one of them is like these paratroopers, like American paratroopers. And then behind is, you can only see the feet, but that's the Virgin Mary. And so the symbolism is like the Americans coming to save us, but then the Virgin Mary represents like forgiveness. So they're forgiving the Germans for what they did. And then do you see the bottom one?
yeah.
Yeah, do you notice anything there?
Is that like a knight in shining armor or something?
Yeah. What about on the sides?
It's like a house.
Okay. Yeah, so you see the house and has a lion under it?
Oh, yeah.
Right. So just to the by the roof of the house, you see those two white things that look kind of like a half of a circle?
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are like parachutes coming in to save the town. And then right above it, you see two A's, like a shield with two A's in the middle. Yeah, so that's for the American military. So that's the 82nd was the group that came in that parachuted in. So they have all these references to the Americans in their stained glass windows of their church, which is pretty interesting. And then the 82nd is actually from the southern United States. So many of the people who were in the 82nd were probably, at least at some point, benefiting from segregation. And so just below the shield, you can't see it very well, is some Latin there. And it says forgiveness and something else. And basically included in this is the idea that forgiving those people from the South for some of the things they did in terms of race. So it's kind of a neat story. But just the fact they have this in their church windows shows how much they appreciate everything Americans did. And then the last one I want to leave you with was kind of a positive story. So all these paratroopers, they didn't know where they were going to end up landing, and they would land in these little villages, and the biggest structure in the village was always the church. So these two medics named Robert Moore and Kenneth Wright landed in this little village, and they turned the village hospital into or the village church into a hospital. And so on the left is the church that's in this little village, and then you can see the two pictures here. The first one is the inside, and then the bottom is the pew. Can you take a guess what the dark spots are?
Blood.
Yeah, that's blood from the people they were treating. So they treated anybody who they to. So they treated obviously Allied soldiers, but they also did Germans and children and civilians. And so they're in there and they're treating these people, and the village went back and forth as to who controlled it. So the Americans came in and they took it, and then the Germans came on a counterattack and took it back. And so these two German soldiers, two or however many, came up to the church and discovered that these American medics were in there serving all these people, and including Germans. And so the German soldiers kind of turned a blind eye and just let these two guys do their work. but that wasn't the case everywhere. So like, two villages over or something, the same thing was happening, and the SS soldiers from Germany found the church and the Americans in it, helping people, and the SS locked the doors and burned the church to the ground and everybody in it. So just kind of this interesting like fate that these two guys came in, and they were let to continue to do their work even though the Germans had rediscovered the place. And then like a third or second kind of twist of fate is like, this is the floor of the church, and this cracked tile is from a bomb that came through the church while they were in it. But for some reason it didn't detonate. It just came all the way through the church and cracked the floor, but it didn't explode. So like another kind of twist of fate that, should have exploded and blown up the whole thing, but didn't. And then the last one was this church has been around obviously way before the war, and it was the church of these two saints, Damien and Comé, and they're the patron saints of like medicine and surgery. And so just oddly that this happened, where in this church that was named after people who cared for the sick. And so the last picture is the grave of one of the two medics. And he came back like in 1998 and had never been back since the war, and just discovered the church and thought that this was the church that he was in. And so he went around and asked some people, and one of the people he treated was like this 13-year-old boy in 1944. And so they went and found that little boy who is now a grown man. And so the two were reunited in 1998. And so then he went back every year. And when he died in 2012 or 13 or something, he wanted half of his ashes to be buried in the States and half of his ashes to be buried in the graveyard of this little church. So that's his gravestone. So half his ashes are here and half of them are in the United States. So it's just amazing the power of individuals, even in these terrible situations, that just somehow power through and do great things. So it was a pretty moving thing to be there and learn about all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, that was cool.
yeah, it's neat stuff.
For the following students, please come to the
Have a good day, guys.
Cheers, Al.
I'll see you in a few days.
Good luck, man.
Thanks.
All right, so we got fourth period rolling in here.
Okay.
All 5 or 6 probably, but
All right. I'm going to stop recording.